We're going to jump right into our next discussion, displacement, wealth disparities, and equitable development. Please share your thoughts by responding to our question, how can cities prevent displacement? Now, please let me introduce our moderator, Marc Norman. Marc Norman is the founder of consulting firm Ideas and Actions, the Larry and Klara Silverstein Chair in Real Estate Development and Investment, and Associate Dean of the Schack Institute of Real Estate at NYU. Trained as an urban planner, he has worked in the fields of community development and finance for over 25 years. Previous to his current positions, he has held the leadership position at the University of Michigan's Ross School of Business as faculty director of the Weisler Center for Real Estate, the DuVernay and Brooks LLC as managing director, Deutsche Bank as vice president in community development finance group, and led Upstate, a center for design, research, and real estate at Syracuse University. Marc?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very glad that our panel is coming up to the stage now and that we're at this moment in the day because as April DeSimone started with a particular parcel in Trenton with stories of displacement, lack of community wealth, and lack of equitable development, I think we're going to expand that frame and talk about some of the solutions to some of those issues at scale. And our panel today covers every side of the development equation, from the governmental to development to investment. And we're going to talk about, similar to the first panel, they talked about trade-offs. We're talking about dilemmas, but we're also talking about innovation and success. And just to frame the discussion a little bit, there are headwinds we're facing right now. Private equity is coming for our single-family homes and our small multifamily. It's what traditionally has built wealth, both for families and for small entrepreneurs. So how do we address that issue? Also, at this particular time, affordability isn't just an issue of the big cities. It's been found that really in almost every jurisdiction, a family making minimum wage can't afford housing without being rent burdened. So we have a number of dilemmas, whether it be ownership or rental. We also have an affordability crisis. We've been talking a lot about affordable housing, but there's also housing affordability. So the ways to make it affordable and to make it equitable. And our panel today is going to cover that, and I will introduce them. So we have Sara is on her way. So I'll start with Anita Cozart, Director of the DC Office of Planning and formerly Deputy Director of Community Planning and Design. We have Andrew Foley, Associate Director of the Jonathon Rose Companies and also an adjunct professor at NYU Schack. We have Julian Gross, Principal of the Law Office of Julian Gross, based in San Francisco, one of the nation's principal experts on community benefits in land use, development, and public infrastructure. And Senthil Senkaran, Managing Principal of the Amazon Housing Equity Fund and previously Senior Vice President, Director of Real Estate Development and Capital Programs at the DC Housing Authority. So what I want to do to start is just to have each of our panelists talk a little bit about their organizations and the ways that they are tackling the affordable housing crisis presently. And maybe we'll start with you, Anita.
Sure, happy to do it. Good afternoon, and want to thank the National Building Museum for inviting me to be a part of this wonderful panel. The District of Columbia Office of Planning, our role is really to think about monitoring land use policy for the district, and this is certainly important to the discussion around housing affordability. About 4 years ago, Mayor Muriel Bowser set forth some housing goals, recognizing that we certainly had been underproducing housing, which is a contributor to our housing affordability crisis. And when she set that goal of 36,000 new housing units by 2025, a third of those being affordable, the other portion of that goal was really ensuring that across the district, no matter which ward or planning area you lived in, there was a floor of 15% of those units being affordable. And that was the first in the nation that I know of setting those affordability goals and that floor throughout neighborhoods across the city. And so today, I'm happy to report we're about 85% towards that goal overall of units, and 2/3 of the way towards the affordability goal. And one of the key pieces that we took on as the Office of Planning was ensuring that our comprehensive plan incorporated those goals, both at the neighborhood level, but then the citywide goal as well. And why that's important is really to signal to DC residents, signal to those who are on both the for-profit side and the nonprofit side, affordable housing developers, that this is a priority for the district and that we are looking to align our policies, our investments towards that goal. And we're certainly happy about the progress that we have, and we've learned a lot along the way. So certainly one of the key pieces of our comprehensive plan, that's our guide for land use and growth, a 20-year guide, is the opportunity to look at how land use and zoning changes can unlock thousands of housing units to get us towards our goal. And so a big part of thinking about that is where we have seen there's parts of the city that have seen a lot of housing units, and then there are parts of the city that have seen almost no housing units. And so we did a lot of work on the front of putting together frameworks and guides and policies that lead to zoning changes along key corridors that are transit-rich, places that have high-quality schools, have high-quality and recently built civic amenities like libraries and parks and rec centers. And we went about the process of working with communities to really explore what are some of those changes that we can realize from the more intense land uses in those areas. And so we've gone about in the last 3 years working with communities and starting to move towards making those zoning changes and proposing those to our zoning commission. The other piece of it is really unlocking the affordability component. We've really looked at places where we can use inclusionary zoning, just one tool in the affordability toolbox, to especially along places where there have been significant opportunities for changes in land use. And so that's a policy that we've moved into implementation, which we hope will signal to those who are committed to affordable housing that there's opportunities for new development there. So I'm happy to talk about lots of other things, but we have other wonderful panelists here. I just want to put one finer point on why this piece around the floor of 15% is so important. There are some parts of our city that have less than 1% dedicated affordable housing. Others have over 40%. District residents recognize that that is completely inequitable, and so that's why that floor is so important. And we are really trying to shift, that's an important but maybe nuanced signal to shift from planning and zoning patterns of the 20th century that have really embedded the racialization of land use and real estate patterns. And so we're seeing that as a potential change.
Great, and I just want to acknowledge that Sara Bronin, Chair of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, and also Professor, has joined us. And Sara, we're actually starting by talking about how our particular agencies or organizations are handling the affordable housing crisis at the moment.
Okay, so thank you so much, and thank you to the Building Museum for hosting this great event. As chair of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, which is the federal agency that advises the White House, Congress, state and local governments, and others on historic preservation issues, we benefit greatly from being a tenant of this building. So I was just upstairs in my office. I think we started a few minutes early, right? Speaking actually with a group of tribal leaders in Northwest, affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians. And the issues that I think we won't touch a lot on tribal housing today, but I just want to flag that type of housing as one that's really important to consider as we talk about all of these policies. But I'm sorry to have joined late. So I just wanted to talk briefly about the Advisory Council and its role in this conversation. So preservationists are sometimes seen as being obstructionists to housing. And I think as a preservationist myself, I hear that sometimes and I say, okay, how do we change this perception? Because if you heard throughout the day, with April's comments at the beginning of the day, talking about her desire to rehab historic housing, through lines throughout all of the panels about the opportunities to address existing buildings and to make sure that we are able to reuse those both from a carbon perspective, because it is the greenest building that's already built, right, typically, but also just from a philosophical perspective. How do we keep in touch with the things that connect us to our past? And one way to do that is to make sure that the buildings that we built, especially those historic buildings that are built in ways that enable them to last forever, can be reused and brought back to life. And that's not just buildings that have been used for housing before, because those are important, but it's also buildings that have never been used for housing. Things that we need to be able to convert in order to restore longstanding community assets. The thing I think of as being a transplant to New England is mill buildings and historic places where industry was built, and all of the rules and regulations that are in place that actually prevent us from converting those to the housing that many of the communities in which these places are located need. Similarly, right now, we're in the midst of another pressing issue across the zoning codes, preservation ordinances, tax credit rules about the conversion of office space. So we all know we've just experienced this huge shift in the labor market, and our rules have to catch up. So the Advisory Council's role in this conversation is to bring that perspective, the perspective of people who care about the built heritage that we have around us, and people who can see that there are ways that they can be brought back to life if only we would get out of our own way. So one dimension of that that we're dealing with right now in our current work is, as chair, I get to do things like call for policies to get reviewed. And so our 2007 policy on housing, I decided let's look at this again. And we're in the midst of revising that. Next week, or maybe the following week, we will be putting it out for public comment. So I will hope that that makes its way to you and that you take a look at it and you see and comment and tell us whether it reflects the best thinking on what we need to do across federal, state, and local sectors to ensure that housing and historic preservation can both be seen the way I see it, as a symbiotic opportunity, but also where we can all work together to reduce the barriers. A couple of the things that we've included in the policy include thinking about standards, design standards that we use to consider whether projects are appropriate. We also have included in there issues related to tribal housing, affordable housing, tax credits, projects that many of you have probably worked on that don't survive without tax credits, combined with low-income tax credits, historic tax credits, new markets tax credits, and so on. So those are the kinds of things that you'll see in the policy. We encourage your comment. I'll also just say one last thing in my professor hat. I do run the National Zoning Atlas. So if you haven't checked that project out, please do. It's at zoningatlas.org. Zoning, Calvin said, for the zoning nerds out there, right, or something. I mean, I think many of us are that, and I encourage you to check that out. It's a data collection enterprise. If we haven't made it to your town, maybe you can do the zoning atlas for your town. Thank you.
Andrew.
Hello, thank you for having me. My name is Andrew Foley. I'm in the development group at Jonathon Rose Companies. So we are a developer, owner, and operator of affordable and mixed income green communities across the country. Since our founding over 30 years ago, our company has been committed to ensuring that our communities have a positive social and environmental impact. I'm in the development group, where it means I build new buildings. My colleagues also are very active in working on preserving existing affordable housing. We own approximately 19,000 affordable housing units across the country in 15 states, plus the district here. And throughout all of our projects, we are committed to building as green as possible and ensuring that our buildings are a platform that enable our residents to thrive. So we look for and build in areas that are high opportunity areas that have access to transit, access to great schools, healthcare, and we do extensive green strategies where we have a proud history of pioneering a lot of green technologies and affordable housing. An example, which I think, Marc, you visited several weeks ago, a project that we're finishing construction on in East Harlem called Sendero Verde, which will be 700 units of affordable housing, ranging in incomes up to 100% area median income, and will be the largest passive house certified building in the country when it's completed. We're also, as I mentioned, committed to building in high opportunity areas, and we're working on projects here in the district, one which you know, up in Columbia Heights, an area that has experienced such an amazing renaissance over the years and is a really amazing place to live. We had a site that had 80 units of Section 8 affordable housing built in the 80s with residents who'd lived there for decades. And as communities are experiencing this uplift and this appreciation and a lot of new residents coming in, our strategy is to not only just preserve the housing that's there, but expanding it. So in that project, we work out a deal with the residents. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about community benefit agreements. And they agree to voluntarily relocate while we build them a new building. And then they come back and are rehoused in a LEED Platinum, Passive House certified green building with tremendous amenities. And we do these in partnerships with all the communities that we're involved in. And I think it's one of the things we're going to talk about a little bit today. So lots to discuss, lots of topics. Looking forward to diving into it.
Julian.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody. I'm Julian Gross. I'm an attorney based in California. And over the last 20 or almost 30 years now, I guess I should say, I've been working on equitable development strategies in a variety of settings. So I've represented community coalitions and community labor coalitions in advocating for community benefits around large, usually urban multi-use projects. I've represented public entities, cities, counties, ports, et cetera, who are managing these developments and try to shape them in an inclusive way, deliver community benefits for the public, balance the many needs that local government needs to take into account when it's shaping these projects. And I also represent affordable housing developers and the trade associations trying to deliver affordable housing. So I've certainly learned some things or had a lot of discrete experiences wearing these hats over the decades. But as a lawyer, I don't often get a chance to be part of a group to reflect and share knowledge and learn from each other and try to synthesize some of the lessons or principles that cut across these different contexts. So I'm really glad to be here today. Really appreciative of Marc and the other panelists and the Building Museum for hosting this event. I'll just, for a couple minutes, talk about community benefits agreements and the sort of values behind them that are applicable beyond just a sort of classic CBA context. So that will hopefully set a few terms to the extent that those principles are relevant to the rest of the discussion. So community benefit, there's no legal definition of the term CBA or community benefits agreement. The term started being used around the early 2000s to refer to a negotiated contract between community representatives and a private developer addressing the quote-unquote community benefits aspects of a proposed development project. The sort of classic CBA that I'm describing is a legally binding contract that is enforceable in both directions. So the commitment of the developer is that if the project is approved and is actually built, it will deliver X, Y, and Z community benefits, including levels of affordable housing, relocation payments, and so forth. And the commitment by the community signers of your classic CBA is that in exchange for the developer's commitment, they are going to withdraw opposition to the project and actually support it. So in the sort of perfect vision, this drives a win-win outcome, improves the project, reassures members of the public who are interested stakeholders that they have a legal right to ensure that these benefits will actually accrue if the project is built, and essentially align the interests around a project. And we're talking usually about complex urban development projects that receive public subsidies a lot of times and can be quite controversial and do in fact need to address a lot of different needs, as I'm sure Andrew's discovered. So that's sort of your classic CBA model, and when it works well, it can really lead to, as I say, aligned interests, shared partnership, and broad support for these kind of projects, as opposed to skepticism and sort of complaining or self-interested actions around the project approvals. Not to go on too long about this, but there are not that many models in the time since the term CBA started being used where this all came together and a perfect CBA was landed that satisfied a broad range of stakeholders and contained all these things. A lot of stars have to align to make that work. But the values that drove the interest in CBAs and continue to this day to drive interest in community benefits agreements, I think are broader and more widely applicable than just that negotiation of a classic CBA that I just described. I think those values, if I could sum them up very briefly, would be inclusivity, which is giving affected local stakeholders and neighborhood residents an actual role in shaping aspects of the project that they care about. We could have a long conversation about planning processes and how successfully they do that outside of this, but that's a key driving factor. Another is transparency, that the ultimate outcomes with these projects should be visible, and that the negotiations leading up to these outcomes should have a lot of transparency as well, so people get a chance to weigh in. And accountability, meaning these community benefits, we could talk about what that means to different people, but that the outcomes of these conversations need to be legally binding and enforceable and treated the same as all the other deal terms that everyone else is asking for with regard to a project. That these be real commitments, not MOUs, not aspirational documents, not handshake deals, not written accounts or memorialization of shared intentions, but actual legally binding commitments, which is what everyone else gets out of a project when they're advocating around it and sort of signing on. So I think the challenge is taking the sort of momentum and prominence of CBAs, drawing out those values and applying them to a great number of different situations, urban and rural, projects large and small, having a vision for addressing the housing crisis, and a vision of equitable development that is large scale, but then fitting those principles and strategies into innumerable discrete projects where the context is going to be very different over and over again. But hopefully if you have that framework in mind and you keep those values in mind, they can be adapted to all kinds of different projects.
Good afternoon. I just wanted to say thank you to Eileen and the National Building Museum team for having me here on this incredible panel. So my name is Senthil Sankaran. I am managing principal at the Amazon Housing Equity Fund. And in that role, I guess I'm here to represent a mission-based funder / investor. But I should also reveal that I am a recovering developer myself, and as well as a former government official involved in housing and economic development. So I've sat on a lot of these different vantage points. So I think this is a great mix of folks for this conversation. So the Amazon Housing Equity Fund was launched in January of 21, January 6th, 2021 to be exact. So not the best day to launch a program. But with the intention of committing over $2 billion to create or preserve over 20,000 affordable housing units in Amazon's hometown communities. So it's the three markets being the Seattle-Puget Sound region, which we call HQ1, this region, which is called HQ2, with our new headquarters in Arlington, Virginia, and then Nashville, where we had a large and growing presence for our corporate operations. But the focus, regardless of the market, is centered around the creation and preservation of long-term affordable housing. So most of our deals that we invest in, we instill a 99-year covenant put in place in order to ensure that there is long-term affordability. But it's guided by a couple of key principles. First, whenever possible, look for opportunities for preservation. And I think we're going to talk more about it in the conversation, but it's something that's very close to my heart. I really strongly believe you have to plug the drain before you can fill up the sink, and it's critical to make sure that we preserve as many of these homes that are affordable currently to ensure that they are affordable long term. Second, I would say another core principle is partnership. We have found that we are most successful when we're able to work in conjunction both with public agencies and other non-traditional housing partners. We have established an excellent relationship and partnership with transit agencies in each of the three markets, whether it be WMATA in this region, Sound Transit in Puget Sound, and WeGo in Nashville. Sound Transit and WMATA are uniquely positioned in that they have considerable amount of land adjacent to their adjacent to their stations, which can be leveraged whenever there's political will to create affordable housing. And then public agencies as well, as I mentioned earlier, where most of our investments are also done in consultation with local governments. We work very closely with the district government. I saw Aspasia here from Prince George's County. I mean, our public partners are critical in that it enables us to understand what the priorities of the jurisdictions that we're operating in so that we can help amplify some of the great work that they're already doing and understanding where the gaps that they're seeing in their goals to achieve affordable housing. And then finally, the fund has a strong focus on equity. And that word means a lot of different things to a lot of people. So for us, it's equity of access, not only for the residents that will ultimately be living in these affordable homes, but also equity of access to capital for folks that have been traditionally shut out of the process, and then actually the development process itself. So one program that the fund has created that we're very proud of is called the Housing Accelerator Fellowship Program, where we've partnered with local nonprofits in each of the markets. In this market, for example, we're working with Momentous Capital, and which they've created a cohort, I want to say, of maybe about a dozen emerging developers at various stages of their process. And it's a 2-year fully funded program in which they get mentorship, access to grant capital, access to development capital, and it's been a great program in which they're sharing knowledge amongst each other. We've started to see partnerships form within these cohorts now working, and then they're also learning from the other cohorts. We take each cohort to the other ones in other regions, And it's a fantastic way for information sharing and actually building of networks. And I have a lot more to talk about, but I'm sure we'll get into it later. Back to you, Marc.
Yeah, I'm actually going to play a little bit devil's advocate here because all of the things that you talked about are great, yet we're still thwarted on the policy front from communities. And the question normally is, well, this isn't going to benefit me. And whether it's affordability or equity or access, I'm wondering in each of your areas how you make the argument for existing communities that what you're doing is going to benefit them. And I'll just throw out, so Amazon comes in and also then funds housing, but is that for the workers, right? Do high-income workers get the benefit of the housing, right? Like that might be one of the arguments. With community land trusts or community benefit agreements, will the developer just pay the fine, right? Like, will it actually be completed? With a developer, will it change my community and how will I benefit? With the city, will the rezoning result in the kinds of opportunities I need? With preservation, the question might be, right, I like the school, I like the industrial facility, but will the reuse also create changes that might not benefit me? So in each of these cases, we're doing great things, I think, but there is this question that lingers, I think, in a lot of people's minds about how does it benefit? And maybe you can't see it directly, maybe it's indirect, but I'm wondering what the arguments we make to get the message across that the changes we're making or the things that we want to do are actually shown as a direct benefit or indirect benefit to the communities we're operating in.
I actually think that the answer to your question is sometimes we just don't know. And the truth is that we have not done a great job as a country of really analyzing the impact of all of these different decisions on outcomes. So when I do research on zoning, I'm surprised to see just a handful of research studies that have focused on long-term impacts of zoning. There's one on Chicago, for example, showing how zoning has affected that city's trajectory over time, but not enough. For preservation, one of the things that we've embedded in the preservation draft housing policy that we're working on is the need for more research. And we identify 10 areas where we just really don't know. So we know that there's been lots of studies about designation of historic properties and high prices in single-family home neighborhoods. However, does that translate into multifamily neighborhoods? What is the impact on workforce? When you preserve or rehabilitate an existing building, most of the costs go to workers, go to people who are actually using it, as opposed to new construction where most of the costs go to materials. So, there's a lot of just dimensions that we just don't know about, and so that makes it really hard for us. I mean, putting on, I guess, back to my professor hat, we need more data, we need more information. So investing in data collection and analysis is something that's really important. I know you guys are all working on in different respects, but.
Yeah, I have to say I'm encouraged by that question because it reminds me of a question I heard from 2 high school students. I make it my business to visit high schools to talk about planning and urban design because when I was in high school, nobody talked to me about it, so I happened to fall into it. That's a story for another day, but I'll never forget this. This was a debate between 2 high school students. They were obviously friends because they sat and huddled in class right next to each other. But they had this vigorous debate about a recreation center that they both lived blocks from. One is this new recreation center. I love it. I love to spend time there. It's fresh and new, and when I go in there, I can do the things that I want to do. And her friend said, they didn't build that for us. That's not for us. That's for the people who are coming into our neighborhood. And she said, what are you talking about? We spend time there. We meet there. We enjoy it. How is it not for us? So in many ways, that says to me, 1, yes, more research. 2, we need to connect people more, and especially young people, because as we're doing our work, it's multi-generational work, to pathways to say, keep asking this question, and at some point, you're going to be, if you're in the District of Columbia, you're going to be an advisory neighborhood commissioner who can ask that question of the developer or of the city. You may be a city council person who can press for what's necessary. You may be mayor. You may be the director of the Office of Planning. And so I think these are questions that are important fundamentally to solving this conundrum that we're in. That's certainly not to minimize the real and direct challenges that people are feeling today because of housing instability. However, it is to say that even while we deal with that, it's important to cultivate this questioning, because that's the way we're going to get to the right tool, the set of tools that are out there, and research out the right tools and design out the right tools.
Your question for me reminds me of a recent rezoning that we participated in. So we're developing a site in Gowanus Canal, publicly owned site in New York City, Brooklyn. Gowanus neighborhood, if you don't know it, is between Park Slope and Carroll Gardens, two of the most affluent, desirable places in Brooklyn to live, former and contaminated industrial waterway. And it was the largest rezoning of the de Blasio administration. 80+ blocks of Brooklyn was being rezoned at one time. Now that's a moment where you really shake things up and who benefits and what do you get. The community doesn't really want to hear from the developers, even developers that are building affordable housing. I think in that example, what was most successful, you need the political will, I think as it was pointed out, but there was a coalition of community groups that formed that were very proactive and early in the negotiation. And they weren't just taking the typical, we don't want any growth, we're just going to be against it, and kind of woo us into the conversation. They were specific, they had key demands, they were diverse, they engaged public, so one of the big asks was, there were two NYCHA communities there that had historic disinvestment, deferred maintenance. And they wanted to advocate for money with all of this wealth that's going to be coming in the neighborhood to make sure that they benefit.
Just real quick.
Yeah.
Acronyms.
New York City Housing Authority, the Public Housing Authority. I think it was mentioned earlier.
An acronym check, just in case.
Thank you. My dean keeps me on track. It resulted in a 56 point of agreement between the City of New York and this coalition, memorialized by the City Council. It resulted in $200 million of investment into these public housing agencies, to the apartments, to refurbish the apartments of the public housing residents. It resulted in a commitment that out of 8,200 units that will be created in the neighborhood, 3,000 will be affordable, of which we're going to be developing about 1,000, so meaningful amounts of affordable housing created. And so we were participating, but we weren't guiding. We weren't the ones out there making the commitments. It was really a community conversation led by a diverse coalition of organizations that really got the deal done. And now they have a quarterly report where we are accountable every quarter along with the City of New York to come to the table and report on the progress that is being made to that neighborhood coalition. So I think it's an example of real success and hopefully building some more trust in these large-scale rezonings moving forward in the city.
Yeah, it's not often I'm on a panel where the developer makes the case for CBAs better than I do, but always glad when it occurs. I do think the CBA model is really good if you're looking at one particular project on a way to get some accountability, as I mentioned before, and get some buy-in from affected residents. But yeah, in California, the housing crisis is mushrooming. It's been in place, it's been building up for 30 years, and it's getting worse and worse. And the prices of housing, especially affordable housing, are going up dramatically, not just in the coastal, urbanized areas of the state, but the rural areas, cities like Fresno and Tracy, inland have had the highest rates of rent increases. And you can't solve anything like that with that kind of focused negotiation around particular proposed projects. It needs policy changes and commitment from the highest level of government in the state and support from the feds. And what we've discovered when, I say we, meaning the affordable housing development advocacy associations and trade associations, have pushed for legislation that would facilitate development of housing and affordable housing around the state with statewide controls and streamlining, is the incredible array of forces immediately lined up against it politically in Sacramento. The National League of Cities is against it because they want local control for all the cities, the State League of Cities. The building trades are against it unless it comes attached with union-only labor requirements, which make construction of housing much more expensive and potentially infeasible in most of the state. Environmental justice advocates or environmental advocates are against it because it reduces the level of environmental review that can occur on a project-by-project basis. And even some of the equity advocates are against it because they're concerned about gentrification in the case of streamlining in a lot of cases. So it's very hard to get anything through, and the only way that I've seen anything really work and punch through those forces is very, very strong, very, very focused, actually truly courageous leadership from the public sector, in particular elected officials, who are willing to say no to people. And they're willing to say, I hear you, your views are important, but we have to compromise. There are some urgent problems here. Nobody's gonna get everything they want, and the answer can't just be status quo anymore. And they're willing to push something through in that very tough way. It needs a huge, this is a problem that can only be solved with the public sector, and the public sector can only be oriented with very strong personal leadership from elected officials, in my opinion.
So Marc, I think your question statement, I think, has in it embedded, I think, a value statement of, and I think it's one that we all, probably all here share, which is that we want inclusive communities, right? So, but in order to achieve that, I think the focus needs to, it needs to start with intentionality, whether in whatever segment of the problem that which you're trying to address. I think from the fund side, the way we look at it is, maybe it's not true for everyone, but I know my budget is fairly finite. I have a pie, and it gets cut up to pay for all the things that I have to pay for in my life. My kids' education, food, housing, transportation, all those things. We've been very intentional in terms of seeking out investments that are transit-oriented. So I think over 95% of our investment dollars have gone out to find projects and invest in projects that are within either a half a mile of either rail or a rapid transit or frequent bus line, because of what we think the ancillary benefits are. Because not only are you reducing your housing costs, but you're also reducing everything else that goes along with it. So your transportation budget goes down. So that it enables you to invest in yourselves and your family. And so that's just one angle. But I think that same level of intentionality in order to, because we value inclusive communities, from each of our perspectives, would be reflected through the work that we do.
Yeah. Sara, to your point, a couple of months ago, there was an article that came out based on data in Minneapolis because, as many of you know, the city of Minneapolis allowed larger multifamily in single-family neighborhoods. And the data showed that the inflation rate for Minneapolis was lower and affordability had actually gotten better because of that rezoning, which of course was hard fought like it is in many single-family neighborhoods. And there wasn't even an explicit affordable mandate, but it was the fact that there was more housing, and different kinds of housing in those neighborhoods. So I think your point about like having the data and then being able to come back to the data to make the case for, let's say, larger scale changes is an interesting one. And it was interesting to see that, because I remember it happening maybe 4 years ago. but not seeing what the results might have been. So maybe this is a question for Anita in terms of, in Washington, D.C., are there ways that you see zoning or other tools that you have at your disposal creating affordability in addition to the kind of traditional affordability we're talking about, that's the affordable housing developer and the tax credits, but in other ways? And are there ways to measure that success if it's happened before, or are you thinking about how to measure it, in your current policies?
Sure. So maybe I'll speak to that by talking about one particular example. As I mentioned, the piece about thinking about kind of high opportunity neighborhoods really intersects with goals that we have around preservation and adaptive reuse. And so along one major corridor of the city in Connecticut Avenue, we have a couple of historic districts, and we were happy to lead some planning efforts in there to really understand how some of the land use designations from our comp plan that allowed for more intense use around these heavy rail stations that also have good transit associated with them, how we could really envision opportunities for adaptive reuse, infill development, as well as new development. And shout out to the chair of our Historic Preservation Review Board, Marnie Keith, who's here. We're going to move forward and share with that board some recommendations about how to do that. So we have the perceived conundrum as it relates to preservation. We're excited to be able to kind of address that and realizing that there may be some real opportunities to see more affordable housing in those areas. Some of those areas actually have some dedicated affordable housing. How do we build out that stock through use of adaptive reuse and infill development? So that's one example of how kind of land use changes can build on zoning incentives for more development, and that could also couple with really understanding the importance of the existing urban fabric and the existing communities that are there.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of the zoning changes happening here in DC are bold and multifaceted, so pat yourself on the back for that. I think the Minneapolis case that you brought up is really interesting, because I thought you were going to refer to the study that showed that despite the rezoning of essentially changing single family to 2, 3, and 4, there had not been enough housing, had not been a lot of housing units actually created. So that study was really interesting, first because it started off with a very short time frame. So of course in 2 to 3 years you're not going to see this big effort, but it also underscored the need to do more than just change number of units in zoning. So you have to think about, as I think you're doing here in DC, things like minimum lot sizes, building heights, although you're constrained here by the Building Height Act, the lot coverage requirements, minimum parking requirements, which was referenced this morning, number of unit size caps. So we have, when we did the Connecticut Zoning Atlas, we saw communities with maximum number of square feet for building units. So they couldn't be more than a certain square footage, which means you couldn't have families, you couldn't have 3 bedrooms, you couldn't bring these drains on the school system into those communities. We saw communities in Connecticut through the zoning atlas there that had 3 parking spaces for a studio apartment. So when you think about that requirement, why was it put in place? What are the consequences? It's those kinds of non-number of unit changes that constrain development that I think Minneapolis is now realizing, okay, we got to get, continue to expand beyond and take a more holistic approach to all the aspects of zoning that control the number of housing units that can be provided. And again, the same is true in historic neighborhoods. Mill buildings were built on lots that simply stopped at the end of the building. So the idea that if you're converting it to housing, you also have to put 300 parking units on the same lot is physically impossible, so then the buildings sit there. But just to say, I know you guys have we thought about that a lot here in DC, and it's rare.
Senthil, I'm just wondering, when you're looking at investments, when you're looking at partners, what are some of the sort of high-level things that are sort of like just a baseline for whether you're going to do the investment, and how do they relate, let's say, to equity for a community?
So, as you might imagine, when we have more projects come to us than we can actually fund. So we do have to go through a screening process, and I'll be honest, the vast majority that come through I would deem as being worthy, and then we have the luxury of picking the ones that we think would be the most impactful. So, I talked about proximity to transit. That's critical. We look very much at what the affordable levels that are actually being pledged. Our target, in order to be eligible for our dollars, are between 30 and 80% of area median income. And then, as being in charge of the fund, I need to make sure that we achieve a good balance. So, but from an impact score perspective, whenever we're looking at our deals, the deeper the affordability that a project delivers, it definitely increases its desirableness, let's put it that way. But location's important as well. And like I mentioned earlier about our partnerships, we will engage, while we won't necessarily speak about a specific project necessarily, but we will engage with local jurisdictions in order to understand what their priorities are. Like our projects here in the district, we definitely know where the mayor is looking to create greater levels of equity. Not to say that we haven't invested in, say, tax credit projects east of the river, but if I'm looking at yet another tax credit project east of the river versus one in Ward 3 along Connecticut Avenue, which is an area that I think speaks to that area, like what you were saying before, where there's only 1%, I think it was the percentage used. That definitely comes into play. And then there's the actual economics of it as well. We truly see ourselves as but-for financing. We do expect that the developer has sourced every other source of capital that they can in order to make the program work. And oftentimes, what we have seen happen is like a developer will bring a program to us, and it might not be interesting in its existing shape and form, but we'll engage with them because we know that they are also mission-oriented, and evolve that to a program that does meet our needs. I think a prime example of that Jonathon Rose brought a project to us that we've closed on here in the district. It's actually one of the first inclusionary zoning projects that was approved in the district, which was having, in which those units were expiring. Actually, you probably know the unit count better. It's about a 600 unit total.
600 units, yeah,
existing. And then there were about 40...
Just under, 48.
48 or so that were inclusionary zoning that were expiring. And there was Jonathon Rose was interested in acquiring the property and wanting to make more of it affordable. The final outcome is now almost half of the property. So it's now like 300 of those units are now affordable long-term for 99 years. And I think it came to us probably something a little bit less than that. And then there was some back and forth about, depth of affordability, length of term, how many units to include, how do we achieve the right balance so that the developer can achieve their goals and that we can meet our per unit investment targets. So it truly is a negotiation, but it's a completely different type of negotiation that I've been part of before, where it wasn't really of like how does one side win the negotiation? It's how do we achieve the goals that we both want? Because without our capital, we knew that project couldn't happen in a certain way, in a way that met the business objectives of Jonathon Rose as well.
Right.
Huh. And so how did your capital go into that particular development?
So it takes different shapes and forms, but typically we are subordinate debt that is a mixture of both hard to pay and cash flow dependent debt and it's usually spread over. Typical loan term might be 20 years or so, but it varies deal by deal. We really try and meet the deal where it needs to be met.
Yeah. So in our investment group was competing against market rate owners of market rate housing, because that's what it was really built for, with just a little bit of the inclusionary. And so without And it, as I think was mentioned earlier, I think Andre mentioned this, like the low-income housing tax credit program, a lot of our resources that we use to build affordable housing are really constrained at this moment in time.
Yeah.
And so I think what made, in our minds, that your participation really novel, and I think a path forward, is that this is kind of a non-traditional investment, and by your investment, we were able to kind of voluntarily admit 300 plus units into affordability without using low-income housing tax credits, without using some of the other tools that are really under pressure right now.
Yeah. And for those folks who aren't from the district, this is a project that's in a great neighborhood in the district called Noma. It's a lot of amenities, access to transit, job center. I mean, so it truly is a fantastic area to live, and I actually don't live that far away either, and my kids go to play in the park right next to the building. So so the opportunity in order to, one, preserve some affordability that was there before, but then actually generate new affordability that otherwise would not be possible in that neighborhood in that type of product is, it's unique.
Yeah, one of the elements of our session is community wealth, and we've talked about affordable housing, and we've talked about making it as long-term as possible. But traditionally, the way we build wealth is home ownership. And I'm wondering, right, it becomes a dilemma, right, because that home ownership benefit's going to go to one family versus, let's say, 75 years or 90 years of affordability in a multifamily building. But the kind of traditional wealth that we typically build isn't embedded in that. And I'm wondering if there are ways that any of you are thinking about wealth generation as part of the equation in, as we think about preserving or building new housing.
Yeah, so just last year, Mayor Bowser established a Black homeownership strike force, really understanding that in a city with a high population of Black residents, there's still a 12-point disparity in homeownership between Black residents and white residents, and that is an opportunity for many people to pass on wealth across generations. And so I was co-chair of that strike force, and we came up with a bold goal of 20,000 net new Black homeowners in the district by 2030. Now, this is bold and a real stretch, especially given the numbers of Black homeowners had been going down over the past decade. This is, again, an important signal of this being a priority, and this goal was adopted by the mayor and embedded in the comeback plan, which she announced earlier this year. And so we went about as a strike force, but then also as district government, really trying to put together initiatives and leverage existing programs and tweak certain programs to move towards that goal. So certainly the expansion of the housing purchase assistance program, providing a lot more down payment assistance for some families, qualifying for up to $202,000 in down payment assistance and closing costs, and making that available was a key piece related to expanding homeownership, understanding from the data that about 3/4 of participants in that program over the past years have been Black aspiring homeowners, and so that is an approach to targeting, and really understanding that sometimes the challenge and the barrier for intergenerational wealth is having legal advice for those who inherit or stand to inherit homes. So we put together a program around that as well. And there's a number of other initiatives that I'm happy to talk about. But this is a really key piece. And through our work of the strike force, we really examined how challenges that exist around things that we had not, as district government, paid super close attention to, but now we are, is around opportunities that exist related to limited equity co-ops and condo ownership, which often is much more affordable for Black households who basically have a net wealth that's a fraction of those of white households, putting a stronger focus on how to support those entities. And the partners at the Department of Housing and Community Development here in the district have been putting together a request for proposals to provide that kind of support. So those are the kinds of things that we're looking at as a district. Those are kind of non-traditional roles, right? And so really partnering with the real estate community, with the housing finance community and others have been essential to this and just created a different way of operating as government.
Great. Julian, I'm just wondering if April, when she was talking about the house in Trenton, was saying that the homeowner really wanted to sell to somebody that cared about the neighborhood. And I'm wondering if, in talking about sort of community benefits agreements and other things, if you've seen mechanisms to allow that to happen. Whether that be in a limited equity way or land trusts or other mechanisms that are built in so that the wealth maybe could be circular or transmitted to other people in the neighborhoods.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything too sophisticated in terms of the sales of the houses directly. I've had a few clients, essentially advocacy coalitions in a CBA context, pushing for some of the things Anita mentioned, down payment assistance, and also support for, sometimes financial support coming out of a project for a local land trust. There's been a few of those. But that's just like to get the land trust funded to buy property generally around the area and hold it in trust, of course. I should probably put in just a little shout out to the other types of asks or components of CBAs that are focused on community economic development. So very frequently, I think in almost every CBA that I've worked on, there's been an effort toward local employment and local business opportunities, just as a way of making sure that the folks that are in the area surrounding a project who are going to be most affected by it, to the extent they're interested, have an opportunity to apply for jobs in the project, sort of have the first shot, first source, referrals for the jobs in the project, have priority access to any workforce development money that the developer's funding or that can be tailored to fit the ongoing jobs in the project, and then local business opportunities as well in the project. So those are, I think, pieces of how people think of the economic benefits that these projects can deliver to the people right there. And that's sort of a classic example of things that are always sort of talked about with regard to urban development projects. And then there can be a lot of skepticism of, well, everyone says that about everything, but actually those benefits weren't borne out. So that's something where there are ways to write it up and make it something that employers in the project sign on to try to find local businesses for service contracts or local workers for their jobs.
Yeah.
So the question is timely in that Amazon, like the Housing Equity Fund, just last week, we launched a pilot program, and I will say it is a pilot, in home ownership. The vast majority of our dollars have been going towards rental product, in which we have selected a partner with NHT, National Housing Trust. We funded $40 million, roughly split between grants and, evenly between grants and loans, in which NHT will then identify best-of-breed partners in each of these markets that are doing innovative things in the realms of affordable home ownership and long-term. So whether it be channeling dollars to land trusts to acquire land to keep in a trust long-term, or other unique models. And it's a big challenge for us because we knew it was a space we wanted to be in, but at the same time, the fund didn't want to be in a position of picking winners and losers, right? So of like, okay, this person, because they were able to get our individual grant, is able to benefit. And like, we really wanted to see if there are models out there that could then be replicated elsewhere. So this is truly just like a learning experience for us. But I do encourage, if folks have ideas or unique concepts, to reach out to our partners at NHT, National Housing Trust, in order to share the models that you're working on and that they can learn from, and then potentially we can grow from there.
Yeah. One of the issues I think that came up in other panels, but I think is relevant here, is the lack of flexibility, whether it be in our zoning or our financing or in other aspects. And I'm thinking, Sara, about just, the stock we have of all, right, whether it's preserving existing housing, office reuse, schools or other things. I'm wondering if you have seen models of how those spaces are reused in flexible manners, and what some of the maybe policy or financing changes might have to happen for that. And I bring it up because we've been talking, I'm based in New York, and some of these laws, you can't, as of right, convert an office building if it was built before 1961. Who came up with that? I have no idea. If it's above Lower Manhattan, it's 61. If it's below Canal Street, it's 1977, right? So it's like all of a sudden, like, those things are taken off the table. The other thing about office buildings, I think this is general, but also New York specific, is it can only be traditional apartments. So it can't be, you can't convert to dormitories, you can't convert to congregate care or SROs or anything else. And so I think about all of the possibilities we have with the buildings we have now, but some of the impediments. And I'm wondering, I imagine you're advocating for some of that flexibility, but I'm wondering what sort of innovation in that space looks like.
Yeah, so you hit exactly on the issue that we as lawyers have the shame of bearing, which is that once we've drafted a law, or once city officials have adopted a law, whether it's zoning or historic preservation, it typically just stays there forever and ever and ever. And instead of upending all of it and overhauling zoning codes, for example, we just add to them. So we actually did overhaul the City of Hartford zoning code when I was there. We threw out the old one and put in a new one, and that was really great and fun, and worked for a very historic city with entrenched issues on a bunch of different aspects. But we made all housing as of right, no special permits or public hearings, no minimum parking requirements, and a whole bunch of other things that I think will ultimately lead to the long-term benefit of the city. When you look at other zoning codes, so New York City is a great example. That code is 2,700 pages long. San Francisco's code is something like 1,300 pages long. Baltimore's is 300, Chicago's is 300 pages long. But the worst of them is actually the city of Boston, which I happen to have done a study for, and it's 3,800 pages long. Wow. The longest in the country. And what has happened in Boston is that every time a neighborhood plan gets changed or updated, there's a new article added to the zoning code specific to that neighborhood with new definitions, new regulations, new constraints. If it's on this street, it's this height. If it's on that street, it's that height. If it's on this block. And when zoning regulators or even preservation regulators kind of stick with one way of doing things and then just the accretion that happens, it makes for regulations that are so bloated, that are so inequitable and are so inconsistent that you just almost have to start from scratch. And that's what I recommended to Boston. So maybe they're working on it. But I mean, if you look across the board, historic preservation law 2 has had a mindset for 60 years, or maybe even more, that there's a certain way to deal with preserving the built environment. And I think for preservationists, for people involved in zoning, for people involved in other aspects of land use, for people involved in drafting covenants even, we have a lot of hubris today when we say this has got to last forever, this is the way it's going to be. And it almost seems like what we should be putting into our laws is an expiration date. Say, okay, well, this whole article expires, and if you don't re-up it, then maybe it's lawlessness, I don't know, maybe it reverts back to some simple rules. But I do think we need a whole different mindset as to how we regulate land use in all of these different aspects, because what we're doing is we're locking communities in, we're not embracing the best parts of them, and we're not enabling growth to happen. And again, we've sort of decided that, well, this industrial, I hate going back to that, but this industrial building is going to be industrial forever. Well, look at Baltimore, Hartford, the post-industrial cities of the world, industry is not coming back. So you have to do exactly what you said, which is to make everything as flexible as possible within reason. So you don't want, one of the reasons why zoning evolved in the first place, the pollution spewing factory next to housing. Okay, so like we need those basic rules, but beyond that, there's a lot of flexibility that we need to embed into our regulations.
Yeah. But regulations are people, right? I mean, there are
Wait a
communities.
minute. Corporations are people and regulations are people.
I mean, we see pushback when we try to make those changes. And in some instances, and Julian, this is a question coming your way, about, when we think about community benefits, those can also sometimes lock in, particular things that might change over time. And I'm wondering how, what are the mechanisms for sort of educating both the developers, city officials, but also communities on being flexible about some of those, the things that we might want today but might change over time?
I think that's a great question. I don't think there's an easy answer. Whether it's community advocates wanting certainty around the things that they're being promised on a project, or developers needing some types of certainty on things that they're expecting and the funders of the project are expecting, or public entity staffers wanting to know that a new administration is not going to come in and change all the priorities for the project over time. I feel like everybody involved in shaping the project wants it to be locked in. It's sort of an unfortunate natural tendency. That said, there are real facts on the ground that can change things and force people back to the table over time. I mean, if a project is not getting built, if it's not feasible, that'll force conversations really quick. And I'm seeing a lot of that already with projects that were approved pre-pandemic and had a big office component or a big retail mall-like component, even then no one wanted to use the word mall, that now they're coming back and saying, wait a second, this needs to be more housing and less of all these other things, and everything we negotiated around office tenancy and jobs at the retail stores, everyone's like, okay, forget that. Let's figure out how we can get more housing in here.
Right. So maybe Andrew and Cynthia, you're advocating for affordability of 50, 75, maybe 99 years. Does that preclude homeownership or different kinds of things that might happen in the future? Right, I mean, I think we talked about what the dilemmas are, right?
Yeah.
And one dilemma might be that, the way we think about affordability and the dimensions of our affordability crisis now are pretty legible to us, but what happens if the ways families constitute themselves, if we want ownership, if we want mixed use or live work or something else, what are some of the ways maybe that we plan for changes?
I'll let you go first.
Well,
I like 99-year affordability. Yeah. Don't get me wrong.
No, but it speaks to one of the dilemmas of home ownership versus rental, in that a lot of what we do is along long-term affordability and preserving the affordable unit as a resource for the community for generations. And the American dream of home ownership is also that it's a pathway to wealth creation, that you get appreciation, and then those can be somewhat at odds, and that you have to find the balance between providing the household enough appreciation so they could develop wealth, but also good stewards of public dollars don't want to give a lot of money just to one family can benefit necessarily. So you have to find that balance between the horizon. I mean, we've looked at some programs that have taken a pretty long-term, trying to really cap the appreciation that the household can benefit from over time. And you think about it, as not just as developers, but on behalf of the household, is is that level of appreciation really enough to build the kind of wealth and to replicate the American dream that many families benefited from for decades and some were deliberately precluded from? And it's one of the things we grapple with when we think about building home ownership at scale. Is how do you strike the right balance? And I know a lot of groups are thinking about different models to try to get that right.
Yeah, I mean, I think housing is a spectrum, right? So I think there's always going to be a need for some level of rental and home ownership. But I think what we've done in terms of our investments is at least given ourselves a seat at the table where if changes need to be made over time, I think there is the inherent flexibility in it. We came in, like I said, in partnership not only with the private developer, but also with the public sector in terms of understanding what the community priorities are. I think that is inevitably going to change over time. Right now, housing and affordable housing and rent is priority number one. This is where I think Amazon does what it does best, which is able to leverage its resources and find a way to plug in to help solve a problem. That problem, no one's saying that problem is going to stay the same over time. But I do think, and I don't think there would be a lot of other more market-driven capital that is also driven towards investments in rental housing if they thought rental housing was going to go away as well. So, I mean, I think there's always going to be a need, and the goal of long-term covenants is really to ensure that there are those opportunities for inclusive communities long-term.
Mm-hmm. So on the subject of Amazon, I mean, it's interesting that a large company has decided to invest and create new systems for housing. One of the dimensions of the crisis is the jobs housing imbalance. And I imagine that's part of the impetus for the housing fund, the trust. But I'm wondering how we all deal with the jobs housing imbalance. Anita, I imagine it's top of your mind as well, right? To maintain that balance of jobs, but have the kind of housing that supports it. But traditionally, and this is all over the country, we've created many more jobs than housing. And I'm wondering sort of how we balance that and if there's innovation in that space.
Yeah, I mean, nowhere is this shown more significantly than in the downtown area of here in the district, right? Even more so than New York. Yeah. The ways that property owners in the downtown have continually leased and invested in office buildings creates sets of areas that feel inhospitable for housing and recreation centers and all the things that make up a neighborhood that people would want to live in. And we've seen kind of the instability in terms of vacancy and lack of economic growth that's come about because of that, and the advent of telework and the fact that a lot of that telework is and hybrid work is concentrated so much within the federal government, right? And so one of the things that we're embarking on is really looking at our downtown and thinking about what are the ways that we can provide those amenities, whether it's in terms of design of the public realm to attract people to want to be downtown, either as workers or visitors, or frankly as residents. That there are parts of, or there's some buildings, a limited number of buildings that have been designed that could be changed from office to residential, and that's something that we're trying to facilitate much more easily. But then there's also buildings that could be converted to university uses, right? And cultural institutions. There are challenges around that when you think about kind of the the tax status of those institutions, and are you bringing in enough? And so, of course, research and analysis is needed to figure out if that provides the vibrancy. Certainly, that creates the vibrancy. Does it help overall the economic engine that is the downtown in the district? And so, for us, really understanding that jobs, housing imbalance, I think is going to help us think about that more broadly in the neighborhoods, and even more so, there's lessons to learn, I think, for the region as well.
Great. Yes.
Just briefly on this, this issue is getting presented very clearly for me in working with Humboldt County in the context of development of offshore wind.
Oh.
So a massive clean energy project in a rural area that doesn't have a lot of economic development, doesn't have a lot of housing, and is going to come with so it's very desirable, locally and globally, I guess I should say. But it's going to come with development of a massive port terminal with thousands of jobs during construction and many hundreds of jobs on an ongoing basis to service and maintain these offshore wind farms, and all the shipping and stuff that's related to that, and the manufacturing of these things. So it's a real open question for local government. What is that going to do to the housing market in this region? Everyone wants the jobs, everyone wants the economic development, but you can't plan these things in isolation. And the approval processes for a project like that are broken up between multiple governmental entities, even just at the local level. Never mind the state agencies that are involved and the feds who are involved, and nobody's looking out for the plight of someone who just needs to rent a place to live in Humboldt County. So it's an ongoing challenge. It really underscores the need with all these types of projects for a cohesive, thought through, inclusive approach by government is the only entity that's gonna do that, and the need for synthesis among government entities as well.
Yeah. I see that we're out of time, and I'm sorry we didn't solve the crisis, but
We did?
we almost did. But I do think having an investor, developer, local, federal, and somebody focused on sort of the ways communities can benefit might be part of the solution. So I thank you all for the panel today.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marc. Thanks, everybody.